Let's develop a relationship map to go ahead and investigate the situation where there's a gap between expected project completion date and the deadline for it. So we'll create a new model, and we don't need any of this. And then once we're here, the first thing we're going to do is save it. We'll call it uh, Project Challenge. And um, variation between deadline and project completion date, and we'll save it. So now it's saved and we won't have to worry about that anymore. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say that here's the deadline, and here is the expected completion date, and the difference between the two of those creates a schedule gap. And as a result of that, let's go ahead and connect these two together so that the difference between the deadline and the expected completion date creates a schedule gap. And then the question is, because there's a schedule gap and I'm responsible for this project, what does it induce me to do? And probably the most immediate thing is for us to decide that it's appropriate to work overtime, which should go ahead and, by working overtime, that adds to the labor quantity. So we'll go ahead and add that piece, and the labor quantity should essentially, or hopefully, reduce the expected completion date. So we have an initial set of relations, so that because there's a gap between these two and we really want to bring the project in on time, so we go ahead and the initial thought is we should work overtime, which adds to the labor quantity. So let me go ahead and here say adds to, and though, is that it? Is am I again looking at a situation where there is a situation and I'm producing a one-dimensional response to that situation? Are there other things that are involved? Well, if we work overtime, we should be aware that that adds to the cost of the project. So here again we'll say adds to, though that doesn't have anything to do with the deadline, it just increases the project cost. Though if we work overtime for any period of time, isn't it likely to cause fatigue, fatigue, so that the work overtime after some delay is likely to produce fatigue, and the fatigue will have an impact on productivity, and it reduces, and the productivity, if we reduce the productivity, it then extends the completion date. So we now have another set of relations, and so if if we're looking at a situation where we would have to work overtime for a very extended period of time to get back on schedule, there are implications of doing that in terms of fatigue, reducing productivity, which could actually end up extending the completion date, and we're not actually ending up solving the problem. So what else is it that we might do? With what we have is the question about labor quantity and productivity. So we could add resources. Oh, I need to put the variable in first. Let me say add resources. Now I did this inappropriately on purpose, in that entities in a relationship map should really be directionless noun or noun phrases. We shouldn't label entities as increasing or decreasing or adds or subtracts. They're entities, and they shouldn't be action oriented, so that add resources is really not appropriate. It should be just resources, and the schedule gap influences us to add resources. The action part is part of the influence, not part of the entity. And when we add resources, that really adds to the labor quantity. Though, is there actually an additional implication that we ought to take into consideration? Well, yes, that adding resources also adds to the cost. Though, when you bring new resources into a project, don't they actually have to get up to speed? And who is it that has to bring them up to speed? Adding new resources to an existing project typically detracts from or reduces, for some period of time, the productivity of the labor force, so that one should be aware that if I simply decide to add additional resources for some period of time, that's going to reduce the productivity. And if I am not working overtime and I'm just adding resources, initially that would actually extend the completion date as opposed to make it shorter, so that things would actually get worse for a period of time before that they would get better. And you will often find that you end up in situations where you have to be prepared for things to get worse before they get better, because there's simply no avenue that allows you to do things without having a short-term negative implication before things get better. And there are lots of models around that present that dynamic. So hopefully this development of another model gives a better sense of how you go about simply working through step by step, looking at, from an entity, what influences and what does it influence, and how do you build out the relationship map so that you have a better sense of things included in the environment that should be taken into consideration before you actually decide what to do to engage with the situation, as opposed to what was initially drawn as the one-dimensional response to the deadline, simply deciding to work overtime and hope that that takes care of the situation. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes we're back into the trial and learning mode. So hope you found this of value, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.